Hello everyone, it's so good to be here again. I just came back from the cinema after seeing a film that I've been very much looking forward to this year. This would be Challengers, the latest film from Luca Guadagnino, a filmmaker that I admit that I haven't seen most of his films. I absolutely loved Call Me By Your Name, and the Suspiria remake also seems like a really interesting film, though I do know that the reception was rather mixed. In any case, he's a fascinating filmmaker that is definitely one to watch, and he seems to be on quite the winning streak, and Challengers seems to be yet another win that he can throw under the belt. So to briefly go over the film synopsis without getting into too much detail, this is a deep character study of these three pro tennis players. At the start of the film, we bear witness to this challenger match, which is where the film's title comes from. And this is actually a very low-ranking tennis event, all things considered. And you might be thinking that this is kind of weird because, well, what's a pro tennis player doing over here? Well, he's there under the suggestion of Tashi, who happens to be played by Zendaya. She as well was a pro tennis player. The key word being was, because unfortunately she suffered a serious injury, which made it impossible for her to continue her professional career in sports. But she has come back as a very competent coach. And not only is she this player's coach, she also happens to be his wife. So as you can see, there's a very powerful dynamic in this relationship, as you can see, and I'll just leave it at that. So here we are at this seemingly low-stakes tennis match, which is supposed to be this freebie win for this down the slumps tennis player who desperately needs a win to just get back his motivation and his drive. But lo and behold, here we are, this tennis match that is supercharged with emotional baggage like you wouldn't believe. Sparks are flying, not only in this tennis match, but throughout the whole film. And yes, as I'm sure you heard by now, yes, there is this love triangle relationship in this film. As you might already be able to tell, there's a lot more going on in this film than just Zendaya going in for a threesome with these two handsome studs. And without going to spoilers, there's actually not that much sex in the film. Is it sexy? Absolutely, but in a very flirtatious and this very arousing way. In that regard, the film is an erupting volcano of erotic tension. But really, the film is, once again, this deep character study between these three characters. Throughout the whole film, we're basically unpacking all their emotional traumas. I particularly love the intro of this film, which is this supreme example of show don't tell style storytelling, which is done through some really clever use of mise en scène where barely any dialogue is spoken. We see the scars of the players, both physical and emotional, and it's so obvious for the viewers to pick up on these because of the palpable tension through the use of clever filmmaking tools. And throughout the film, there's this very clever use of these mirror effects, as I will call them, where on regular occasions the film reflects no pun intended, where the film reflects these actions that our protagonist can take that end up coming back in really interesting ways. There's truly some really clever symbolic use of this throughout the film, both in small, minute ways, and then in some larger picture ways. And they always have a very interesting way of integrating themselves into the beating heart of the story. I thought it was kind of genius. And to add one more example on top of that, the tennis court themselves being these two sides, and both characters indeed end up switching sides regularly throughout the film. And this is also a narrative tool where now we're going to look at through another character's perspective, where we are treated to these flashback sequences that are used to great effect. Honestly, I'm kind of blown away by how well integrated they are into the film. They are always pertinent and they never bog down the pacing of the film, which is a delicate balancing act that few filmmakers are able to achieve. Each of these scenes end up being these very revealing moments that define each of these characters' lives, and they act as these stepping stones towards the present time where we are at this challenger match. There's this incredible layering effect where the film just builds to this incredible crescendo. And once again, to speak of that mirroring effect that I talked about before, there's this constant back and forth through these flashbacks somewhere along the timeline. And what does that back and forth recall us? The tennis court itself, the tennis playing itself, the ball going back and forth, back and forth. It is actually quite ingenious how all these elements layer on top of each other so seamlessly. There's so many things I could praise the film for. I briefly alluded to this before, but there's so much meaning loaded into these scenes where there's no dialogue spoken. This can be used through the way characters look at each other or how they just live with themselves, their minute mannerisms, even the way that someone parks their car. That just teaches so much about the character's mentality and their place in life. There are so many wonderful little details like that, but of course, the tennis playing itself is also a very non-verbal event that is a supercharged narrative tool that just speaks volumes of information without uttering a single word. Honestly, it's kind of genius. The climax of this film, of this tennis match that we've been dying to see its conclusion, is simply explosive. There is no other word for it. So as I'm sure you can guess by now, but we have A-tier performances across the board in this film. The chemistry between Josh O'Connor and Mike Feist is electrifying, complex, and intriguing. It is such a juicy and competitive relationship in the best way possible. As I mentioned earlier in the film, sparks are flying. There is so much tension in the film, and both actors just totally embody it so flawlessly. And indeed, there's this perfect balance of this weight distribution between all three protagonists throughout this love triangle, which is no small feat, and it really speaks to the quality of the screenwriting, which I find is top tier. Which, speaking of, this is written by Justin Karitzkis. He does have experience as a playwright, but as far as a feature film, as far as I can tell, this is his first film, which is a phenomenal achievement, and also is a really cool anecdote, which I didn't know going to this film. He is the husband of Celine Song, who wrote and directed that phenomenal film Past Lives in 2023. Without question, one of my very favorite films that year. So clearly the screenwriting talent runs in the family. So yeah, knockout performances from both lead actors, absolute phenomenal work from both of them. And I do want to give a special shout out to Josh O'Connor, who has a second slam dunk in 2024. His previous one being La Chimera, this brilliant Italian film, which, by the way, he speaks very fluent Italian in that film. I do highly recommend you check out that film and also my review on it. But no matter, back to the acting in this film. Of course, last but most certainly not least, Zendaya. I'll be honest with you guys, I was never the biggest Zendaya fan. I'm not hating on her in any way, shape, or form. I think the movies I've seen her in, she did a good job for most of them, but I never thought that she had a particularly juicy or meaty role that she could just lose herself in. Well, here in Challengers, this is without question by miles her best performance thus far. She has this ironclad confidence in this film that just demands your attention. And because of that, she's able to manipulate both boys pretty much flawlessly throughout the whole film. There is this element about her toxicity and her manipulation that makes me think of J.K. Simmons in Whiplash. Obviously, maybe not to his extent of physical violence, but there's this emotional torture that she puts on the characters here. There's this oppressive weight around her, both on the tennis court and outside the tennis court, that is just rather suffocating in many ways. Once again, the intro sequence of this film speaks volumes to that without barely uttering a single word. And perhaps one of my favorite scenes in the film is rather early on. So to give ever so briefly a bit of context around the scene, this is one of the earliest flashbacks on the timeline where both our male protagonists first laid eyes on Tashi, and they are completely enamored and aroused by her tennis playing skills, which are absolutely dominating at that time, and also everything about her demeanor and personality. It was impossible not to be moved by her in some way, shape, or form. And in this sequence, we see her on the beach, which once again is a perfect setting to have this siren-like vibe about her. And she's wearing this beautiful blue dress, and she looks quite ravishing, if I might add. There's wind billowing with the waves of the water. It's nighttime. There's even a full moon perfectly framed in the back of her. And in this sequence, she delivers a very passionate speech where we get the first revealing philosophical elements of her view on life and tennis. And to underline all of that, the soundtrack at this moment is very delicate, ethereal, harp-like playing. And it is a theme that is repeated throughout these pivotal moments throughout the story, which I thought was quite ingenious. And speaking of the soundtrack, I didn't actually click onto this until the very last frame of the film, but this is a soundtrack that was done by Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross, and it is an absolute banger. Yet another banger from these guys. We already knew that they were killing it with Nine Inch Nails, yes, of course, but they seem to be on this never-ending win streak with film soundtracks. Holy crap, guys. Clearly, they have an insatiable appetite to deliver these great soundtracks for a whole wide range of films, Challengers being the latest one. Now, as you can see, I'm rather head over heels in love with this film, but if I had to be critical about the film for a point or two, on a technical level, this film is rather superb. The editing is just on point, and it's just such a muscularly powerful film in so many ways. That being said, there are a few really uncanny camera works here. Now, I'm the first person to totally invite a bit of wildness and creativity in some of the camera work, but in terms of consistency with this film, it's so far out there from anything else in this film. I'm pretty sure anyone who's seen the film will know exactly what I'm talking about. There won't be any gray zone whatsoever on what those moments could be. Now, it's not something that breaks the film for me, but it is something that kind of was jarring to the experience. And for my second point, in a similar aspect, when it comes to bringing me out of the immersion of the experience, once again, without going into too much detail, there is a storm that happens later on in the film. Now, as far as it being a narrative tool that's used for this climactic moment in the story, where it's placed in narrative structure in the film, I think that's aces. I love the way it's used, but the storm almost gives off this minor hurricane-like vibe, and there's a moment where the characters are outside in this storm, and they seem comparatively unfazed to the severity of the storm. There's literally winds billowing, big chunks of things and pieces of plastic and paper and all sorts of rubbish just flying in the air, and the characters are standing there in the midst of this chaos, rather unfazed and unmolested by the carnage raging literally everywhere around them. It felt a little unrealistic, but there you go. These are nitpicking details. It's not something that's going to break the back of this film, of course. But I do think it's worth bringing up, if for no other reason than just for comedic effect. I do find it curious that when looking up this film on the internet, it is described as a romantic sports comedy, which in a way is not inaccurate, but I don't think it quite captures the tone of the film. As I mentioned not too long ago, I do see much more tonal comparison to a film like Whiplash, because I find the film so gripping and tense in many ways. And it is also just loaded to the brim with action and emotional drama. And that's not to say that it doesn't have a humoristic touch. It absolutely does. Honestly, this film is quite the package deal of this assembly of many different emotions. And it weaves them all fantastically together in this cohesive whole, and it never feels disjointed or cumbersome. So yeah, this film has expert pacing and top tier screenwriting. Probably gonna be one of the best films of 2024. So yeah, this is easily a 9.5 out of 10. Hot damn, this is an absolute smash hit. Not that I thought this film was going to be bad, but it wildly surpassed my expectations. Definitely go check it out, my highest recommendations. So with all that being said, wishing you and your loved ones nothing but the best. Take care and talk to you soon.